Good morning, everyone. So Keith already asked you how you were doing. It seemed like you're a little lackluster this morning, so let's do a little better. How's everybody doing this morning? All right. Sleepy. I mean, I'm looking at the weather outside and saying it's a little cloudy out there, but I think the forecast says it's not supposed to rain today, so that'll be good. So here we are, the last day of the conference already. It's been a pretty good conference, I think, so far. A lot of good information that we hope you'll carry home with you and even implement it in your lives and in your families to build on some of the things you've heard here. We understand that the information you get at a conference like this is just that. It's information. It's information and tools to try to help you bring home and build and make a better family, because the families are the strength of the assemblies. So, speaking of families, I'm a new grandparent twice in the last 3 months, so we're pretty happy about that. Little Zechariah right back there just turned 3 months old today. Hannah and David's little one. Incidentally, they'll be married for a year tomorrow, right? Okay. And then my son Jared and his wife Tally had a baby about 2.5 months ago, so we're pretty excited about that. What? Oh, weeks. Sorry, yes, weeks. 2.5 weeks ago. So we're pretty excited about that, and of course we have Caleb's running around here, and a lot of you have seen him and probably know him. And Caleb's 11, so it's been 11 years between groups of grandkids.
Speaking of children, the child care team is out if anybody wants.
Yes. Child care is out and ready for any children of your children who want to. Looks like they're all out already. So, all right. Anyway, so asking a question: how many of you here are grandparents? All right. Good number of you. Do we have any great grandparents here? All right. Any great? Yeah, that's stretching a little. I understand. All right. Exceptional grandparents. Why didn't we name it that? I want to be an exceptional grandparent someday. But what I want to talk about a little bit today is those generations and how that affects our view of family. So, family, here to stay, last line of defense. So that's the theme of the conference this year. And we've talked about it a little bit. And I liked how Jake yesterday brought in the idea that it's also the first line of defense. That was something very significant I hadn't really thought about before. But so here we are, here to stay, last line of defense. The reason that we have put together these conferences over the last 6 years is because we got together, a bunch of us, handful of us, 6+ years ago, and decided that there wasn't enough talk about how family and family life affects the assemblies. But it's critical. It's the thing that matters. And so here we are today, the last day of the conference again. And what I'm going to talk about today is togetherness, the family as one. So we've heard a lot of information this weekend, holding the line in our society, making sure our families understand our values and where we're heading with that. We've heard a seminar about practical training and how you actually put hands on and how you train your children. Character training and how important that is in the cohesiveness of our family, raising our children and our marriages. And then we had the breakout sessions yesterday, men's and women's, where we talked about the different roles and how those play into the family as parents and spouses and that type of thing. So I want to try to bring that together a little bit today. And first thing I want to talk about, so there's going to be 4 things I'm talking about this morning. One is the first subject, the cultural norm, our Western society expectations of family. And then I'm going to go over the biblical expectation and look of a family. And then we're going to talk about the family in unity, and then in real life, what that looks like. So, here we are in the United States of America, Sterling, Illinois. And for most of this country and Western society, there's a picture of what a family should look like. And it goes something like this. First, it's a collection of individuals living in the same space, sharing the same resources. Okay, so that's just a very broad definition. But I get that at work, right? 8 hours a day at least. I work with people who I'm sharing the same space with, using the same resources, and there's an expectation that we have a common goal. So just because you're in the same space, sharing resources doesn't make you a family, okay? But in this Western society, it's sort of become that. The second thing is that it's temporary in nature, and the parental responsibility ends with the age of majority, which is 18, legally 18 in this country. Now, some people will make the case that the biblical age is 20. Now, you take that or leave that, it doesn't matter. But it's the idea that at a distinct point in time, you as parents no longer have responsibility for your children. That's the Western society model. The third thing it teaches is that each individual has rights rooted outside of the family unit given to them by the government. So, if at 18, your child decides they want to leave your house against your will because you don't think they're ready for that, they have every right to do that. The government says, okay, and the government will enforce that if the child makes that decision. One aside, talking about age and things like that, this idea of adolescence, it's a very new invention. Throughout most of history, there was no adolescence. You grew up from a child where you got to go through life having your parents take care of you, and you just grew into an adult. This idea that between, let's say, 13 and 18, you were somewhere, you were like, you had childlike responsibilities, but got the benefits of being an adult, that's a fairly new invention in history. All right. There's also the idea that children are expected to be responsible to authority outside the family. So public schools, sports teams, jobs, they're responsible to other people that aren't part of the family unit. Now, there's some good things about that. It's good to teach our children that they can be responsible to other people, to honor and respect other people and that sort of thing. But what it also does is it takes power away from the family as the main unit that the children are functioning with. And we both homeschooled and sent our kids to public school. And the challenge, of course, with public school is that for, let's say, 8 hours a day, from the time if they're riding a school bus, get on the bus, go to school, by the time they come home, they've usually spent more time every day with people outside their family than they have with their parents, their siblings, etc. But that's the model we work with right now. This Western society idea of a family also says families are not seen as multi-generational with a view towards building long-term legacy. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes a little bit more about what exactly that means. And then finally, in our modern society, we typically only have 2 generations living under one roof. This idea of a nuclear family. You have parents, you have children. The children reach the age of 18, they move on, and they start their own family. This idea of a nuclear family is something that really only took root and sprang up in the 1950s. I did a little research on it. The best I could find was that the term nuclear family was first mentioned in a magazine article in 1924. And it didn't gain much traction then. But after World War II, we had a situation where a lot of young men went off to war, were killed. Women were in the workforce then. And I'm not here to preach for or against any of that stuff. I'm just trying to lay out what has happened in our society. And as a reaction against that, it was mostly evangelical Christianity who said, no, this is what a family looks like. It's 2 parents, few kids. Back then it was a lot more kids than it is now on average. White picket fence, American dream, 2 or 3 cars in the driveway. That sprang up mostly through the Christian church. And this idea of an extended family then, which was the norm up to that point, sort of took a back seat. And by extended family, we're not only talking about multi-generations in a household, but sometimes aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever it was, that lived together and learned together and shared these resources together. And mostly in our congregations, I would say we've grabbed onto that Western society model of what a family looks like. Some of it we're going to have a hard time doing anything about, but I'm going to hopefully show you what the biblical view is, and you can decide what pieces and parts you can plug into that makes sense for your family. So let's talk about that. A superior model, a biblical expectation. First, a family is a well-functioning organic community with individual parts functioning for the good of the community. So how many of us here think of our family as a community? Anybody really much think of it in those terms? A few of you maybe. But we so we'll come to our assemblies here, our congregations, and we'll think, well, yeah, that's sort of like a small community. And, we live in a town or a city or whatever, and we think of that as a community. But really, a family is a community of people. It's people joined together for a purpose. The biblical example is a family has generational vision and goals. And I want to read here from Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 6. I'll pull that up on my phone. It's part of the 10 Commandments. Yahweh says, "You shall have no other Elohim before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them. For I, Yahweh, your Elohim, am a jealous El, visiting the iniquity of the fathers to the children on the 3rd and the 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments." Exodus 20, verses 3 through 6. So we have this idea that what happens in one generation is passed down to multiple generations. It talks about 3 or 4 generations where what you do in your household now affects a whole lineage and legacy of people for generations to come, good or bad. There's this financial newsletter I read by a guy named Bill Bonner, and he's not really famous out there, but I read it mostly for his writing style. I decide what I read by how someone writes rather than whether I agree with it or not. And that brings me to some interesting places because I think it's good for us to get information from people we don't agree with as much as people we do agree with. But anyway, point being, he's a newsletter writer, entrepreneur. He's into real estate and different things like that. And he set up his family in such a way with his children and now grandchildren so that they're building this family empire, I guess you would call it. And he's realized that in order for his children and grandchildren to survive generation after generation, he has to be thinking about that now. So he has his children all involved in this. And they'll do things like go and buy a dilapidated house in the middle of Baltimore, and they work on it as a family project, multi-generations. And not only does everybody have buy-in to what they're doing then, but it's the way the family functions and works together and sort of, that's how they spend their time together. So, and he even has some of his adult children that are scattered to different parts of the world, but when he puts one of these projects together, they'll all come together and help out. And I think that's a very sort of cool model of what our families should look like as we go through the generations, instead of just kicking our kids out when they're 18 and say you're on your own. In the biblical expectation of a family, grandparents, parents, all have a great-grandparents and generational, through the generations, have a continuing role in teaching and training for as long as generations overlap. sometimes as much as 4 or 5 generations. And I want to read a passage from Genesis chapter 50 here. And beginning with verse 22. Now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the 3rd generation of Ephraim's sons. Also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but Elohim will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he has promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. How often do we see that in the Scripture? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Over and over in Scripture. Yahweh's trying to impress upon us that this family is carried through generation after generation. And it says, Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, Elohim will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years and was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Joseph had such confidence that the following generations were going to carry out his wishes that he just said this like it was going to happen. Promise me. He knew that generation after generation after generation, however long it took, would respect that wish because that was the mindset of the family. The next thing we learn about the biblical family is all authority resides in the generational structure of the family. So whereas the Western society nuclear family gives authority over to the state, and if you don't believe that's true, a little bit later we're going to be talking about step families here. And in any situation where there's a divorce, there's a decision about custody, about children, the state decides all of that. What happens there? The parents, they might have some input into the decision, but ultimately a judge sits and says, here's where the child's going to go now, here's where the child's going to go now. The state controls it. In the biblical model, all that authority resides within the family. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. They make all those decisions. They make those judgments. Society doesn't allow us to do that now. But that's a biblical model. We talked about public schools versus homeschooling, and that's a big topic. But I do want to read a passage from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7, which we're all familiar with, which shows us our responsibility as parents. Whether you believe homeschooling or public schooling, either one is a good or bad thing, here's what the Scripture says about your children. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. The expectation is that your children are with you all the time, and you're teaching them, and you're setting the example for them. Mentoring, that's the homeschooling versus public school thing. We talked about jobs a little bit as the Western society expectation. Again, I'm not arguing against our children having jobs, but mentoring and training within the family was the biblical model. So your father did this, you learn that trade. And that went on for a long, long time. Again, it's only recently that this division of labor came about in our society, mostly as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And in some ways, it's a very good thing because it makes us more efficient, it makes us more prosperous, it makes us more wealthy, all those things. But what it also does is divides the family. And these are just subtle things that we sometimes don't think about. We talk about the big things when it comes to family and how to deal with troubles and divorces and abortion in our society and homosexuality and all that. But the thing is, it's been a long time. It's been several generations now where we've been making this shift, and slowly every piece of what makes a family has been torn apart. There's a senator in Nebraska, first-term senator, named Ben Sass. And he recently wrote a book called The Vanishing American Adult. And I don't have a copy of the book yet. I'm going to get it because I've read several excerpts from it, and I saw him do an interview. And I love what he's saying about the family. And it's a totally non-political book. So he's a historian by trade. He was a college professor and administrator. Then a few years ago, he decided to run for the Senate, got elected, and he's sort of out there, a libertarian, conservative, radical, sort of all on his own. And I've come to admire his views on things. And one of the quotes from the book is this. He says, "Our goal is for kids to be intentional, to reject passivity and mindless consumption, and to embrace action, productivity, and meaningful work." Again, we're not going to get into the whole sitting on the couch playing video games culture we're in right now. But what this quote is trying to explain to us, and what he puts into practice with his own children, is that you're going to work. You're going to work within the family, and you're going to work for your neighbor. And you're going to learn these values. You're not going to waste your time sitting on the couch watching TV, playing video games. All right. And then one more thing I just want to reiterate about the biblical example of the family is it was often 3 or 4 generations living under one roof. When I grew up, I knew families that the grandparents were still living with the family. And you see that occasionally now, but it's not very prevalent. I mean, in our society, as a matter of fact, we don't even have that nuclear family intact in most cases, right? So there's a lot of single parents, and it's very difficult. It's difficult, first of all, when you go from grandparents and great-grandparents being in the house, helping train and teach the children, down to just 2 parents and children. And then we go down to a single parent and children. It just deteriorates the ability to make the family function in a meaningful way. All right, now shift gears a little bit. The family in unity. What does that look like? From early childhood, we teach that the good of the family takes precedence over the individual. Now, here in the United States of America, we want to be rugged individualists. I talked about community earlier. The biblical example is not one of rugged individualists. Yes, Yahweh sometimes called people to leave their families and travel far and wide to do his work. That does happen sometimes. But for most of us, that is not the biblical example. The biblical example is the idea of community. Acts chapter 4, verses 31 through 35 talks about how the early believers in the apostolic assembly had everything in common and shared with one another. That's a concept that's very foreign to us and one that we bristle at a little bit because we've been brought up over the last 50 years, this idea, and I agree with the idea that socialism and communism are a terrible thing because they don't lead where they're promised to lead. But living in community under Yahweh's authority and direction is a biblical model. And we're talking specifically about family, but this idea of this fierce independence that everybody within the family has their rights is not a biblical ideal. So from early childhood, it's important that we teach that the good of the family takes precedence over the individual. Each individual is both special and important to the well-being of the family. So in some families I've witnessed over the years, children have a secondary role in the family. And I don't just mean a different role where they're under the parent's authority. I mean a role where once they move on from the cute little baby stage they somehow have less value to the family. Especially in the generation, my generation and the generation that's followed, baby boomers, Generation Xers, millennials now, there's this idea that your children are just there, you've decided to have them, and they may or may not be an important part of your family. So I want to reiterate that each individual, mom, dad, all the children, have a special place, an important place in the family. In a family in unity, love and grace are the two most important characteristics in a unified family. I'll pretty much just let that stand. That goes with our whole being as believers, though, right? That's our model, to have love and grace for each other. And even more so within a family, people we're interacting with every day. And especially towards our spouses and children. Roles and expectations. Now, here's a tough one, I think, for most of us to get our minds around. Because we're going to go back, I'll read it first. Roles and expectations should be based on strengths of family members, not exclusively on predefined traditional roles. So in this idea of a nuclear family, now I remember I said it was promoted mostly by evangelical Christianity, and we grabbed onto it. And we still see it in our congregations all over the place. Now, I'm not arguing against biology. If I'm going to paint with a broad brush, I'm going to say that women are better at some things and men are better at some things. I don't think there's any sense in denying that. Having said that, I'll give an example from my own household, my own marriage. I can't stand doing plumbing work in my house. My wife may or may not like plumbing work, but she's way better at it than I am. So if there's a broken faucet, a broken pipe, the shower's leaking, whatever, she goes online or she goes to Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever. She gets the part, she gets the tools, and she fixes it. Sometimes this happens when I'm at work. I come home, voila, magically it's fixed. I went to work, it was broke, come home, it's fixed. It happened with a dishwasher a couple years ago. I came home at lunchtime, she had it all torn apart. I came home at supper time, and it was fixed. So anyway, that's sort of a non-traditional role for women in our circles. Now, on the other hand, she won't touch anything that has to do with electricity. So if there's something not working, she'll change a light bulb. But if there's something broken that has to do with electricity, that just scares her. So I do that. If car repairs need to be done, it's sort of 50-50. Depends on who gets to it first or who calls the garage first. Well, if it's going to the garage, she usually makes that appointment. But what I love is that she knows so much about cars because her dad worked on cars when she was young. And she stood behind him, talk about mentoring, stood beside him in the garage, in his machine shop, so making tooling and do all kinds of things, and then making parts for his cars and fixing them. And she just learned how to do that. So if we're not going to take on that repair ourselves, she goes to the garage. I don't have to think about, are they pulling something over on her? Because they're not going to be able to. Now I want to talk about our children a little bit, though, too, right? Because Keith talked about practical training yesterday, and he brought up just some excellent points in that talk about how we have to structure our children. But he brought out something very important. Every single child is different. So this child, you can train them to do a certain thing. You have a task that you want all your children to learn. This child over here, very easy. They're able to do it. You got another child, not so easy. I would contend it's our job as parents to find out the strengths and weaknesses of our children, and at some point realize that some of them are going to be pretty mediocre at this task, and there's no sense in making them do that for the rest of the time in your house. Find something else that they're good at. Now, there's some things that's important for every child to learn, obviously. But there's certain things we can have sort of that, figure out what they're best at and promote that. So just something to think about there. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about a little bit, and this is people sort of bristle at this when I bring it up sometimes, but I'll just say it plainly. Instilling self-esteem in our children as a primary goal is proving to be destructive. Let me say that again, because I don't want you to miss it. Instilling self-esteem in our children as a primary goal is proving to be destructive. So there was a movement in this country, I don't know, probably started 20 years ago, where we all of a sudden said, man, we don't want any of our children to feel bad at all. So what are we going to do? Well, we have to make sure they have self-esteem. Well, I want you to think about the term self-esteem. First, it's self. And then it's esteeming yourself, saying, boy, I am pretty good, aren't I? That's what self-esteem is. The Bible, of course, teaches us to esteem Yahweh above all else. But what the Bible also teaches us is that self-confidence is a result of a loving, nurturing, supportive family. Self-esteem is a primary goal that you're trying to instill in somebody by all kinds of different means. Self-confidence is what we want our children to have, what we want our spouses to have, comes from being in a loving, nurturing, supportive family. So it comes about as a result of, instead of as a primary goal, like self-esteem is. Another quote I came across from Senator Ben Sass from that same book. He said, we're not doing enough to celebrate scar tissue. We're not doing enough to celebrate scar tissue. What does that mean? What is scar tissue? Scar tissue says, I've had some kind of deep wound. I've had something bad happen to me, and I've come through it, and I'm stronger because of that. That's what scar tissue is. If you get a cut, you have a scar somewhere on you, it's because something went wrong, your body fixed it. And so instead of this idea of instilling self-esteem, we let our children learn from mistakes, from hardships, all under our protection and care, and it brings about the self-confidence that we want them to have. Another point I'd like to make. Compliments not coupled with merit nurtures narcissism. We complain that this millennial generation coming up is a bunch of narcissists. All they do is think about themselves. But is it any wonder when I scroll through my Facebook page, and almost daily I can see a picture of a young woman posted there, and nothing wrong with the picture per se, except all the comments I hear is, isn't she beautiful inside and out? Okay? In my mind, when I read that and see that, I understand it's a way to try to encourage. But what the encouragers really want to say is, boy, you're really beautiful on the outside. But they feel obligated because they're presenting themselves as spiritual people or people of faith to say inside and out. But the inside's sort of a secondary thought. It's sort of like covering the tracks of saying, like, man, you're really beautiful. I like the way you're made up, dressed, whatever. And again, there's nothing wrong with encouragement, but I want to remind us of what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7. I'll read that for you a minute. Here's how Yahweh views things. But Yahweh said to Samuel, do not look at his outward appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For Elohim sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks at the heart. We say it, we teach it, we proclaim it, but I don't think we really believe it and don't want to go there. That Yahweh truly does only look at the heart. And that's our way of identifying people. It should be our way of identifying people. If we believe it, then I think we should act accordingly. So compliments not coupled with merit nurtures narcissism. If you want your children to only think of themselves, then praise them not on merit, but on their looks, on whatever else, people do to build up their children. All right. Now I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about what some of this looks in real life. What should a biblical family look like? Break bread together. Make mealtime family time. We've talked about this quite a bit. It was mentioned last night during the Family Feud game a couple different times. It's one of the most important things you can do. The meal as a community event has been something that's been in place for thousands of years. I mean, think about when we come here. The food that's being set out right now is just as, or maybe more important than what I'm talking to you about right now, right? Yahshua recognized that when he was going to feed a whole bunch of people with not much, and he said, basically, I know you're just here for the food. That's okay, I'm going to give you some food. So it's part of who we are. And in the family, that time becomes even more important. Because in this nuclear family, Western society model that we have, you don't have your kids at the table for very long. I know a family back where we live in Michigan. I think they have 10 or 12 children. And most of them are adults now and have gotten married, moved out in many cases. But they're Sabbath keepers. And every Friday night, still, their table is open to whichever of their children want to come join them. So it's mom and dad and a couple of younger kids still living at home, but many times they have a whole slew of them come in. So there's some Friday evenings they might only have a handful at their table. There's other times where they have 20 or 30 there. And it's not like they set up invitations. It's just, that's it. That's the open invitation. Because that's what they did since they were young. And it's sort of a thing that I think we've lost. Don't spend more time with social media than you do with your family in real life. Be present and engaged. If you're home with them and you're on Facebook and your child or your grandchild or your great-grandchild comes up to you and says, "Can you play?" Then the answer is yes, I can. I have time for you. And you put down the phone, and that's it. Can't say that I haven't been guilty of transgressing that more than once. So I know it happens. Be careful how you present your family to others. Don't complain about your spouse or children to other people. Now, there's times where we need advice from people. Gossip and getting advice are not the same thing, right? Too often that happens. I even hear it in prayer requests sometimes. People will pray something that they're asking for help, but at the same time, they want you to know something about somebody. And it might be a member of their family, or it might be somebody else. But they're trying to say, you should all know this about this person. During prayer time is not the time to bring your family's faults to the attention of others. So be careful how you present your family to others. I mean, it happens at where I work all the time. People complain about their spouses. It just goes on continually. I've worked in the same office for 12 years now, and I know most of my coworkers. Many of them I worked with for a good share of that time. I know them pretty well. And it's a thing that goes on all the time. And they know me pretty well by now, too, that I just say, I don't want to hear it. And they've learned to be okay with that. Work to build character, not egos. I'm going to read quickly from 2 Peter chapter 1. Okay, sure I am. 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning with verse 2. Grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of Elohim and of Yahshua, our Master, seeing that his divine power has granted to us everything pertaining to life and righteousness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. For by these he has granted to us his precious and magnificent promises, so that by them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. Now for this very reason also Applying all diligence, in your faith supply moral excellence, and in your moral excellence knowledge, and in your knowledge self-control, and in your self-control perseverance, and in your perseverance righteousness, and in your righteousness brotherly kindness, and in your brotherly kindness love. For if these qualities are yours, are increasing in the true knowledge of our Master Yahshua the Messiah. For he who lacks these qualities is blind or short-sighted, having forgotten his purification from his former sins. Therefore, brethren, be all the more diligent to make certain about his calling and choosing you, for as long as you practice these things, you will never stumble. Before I said compliments not coupled with merit nurtures narcissism. When we unduly compliment our spouses or our children based on things that are just meant to build up their ego, it doesn't build this character within them. So we need to be careful about that. We need to play, pray, and work together. We've talked about that a little bit in mentoring and how generations past made that happen. Parents, make sure your children clearly understand the vision and goals for the family and give them a voice within the family. Allow them to respectfully challenge your ideas and be engaged in setting the course. One of the things that happened at our dinner table when our children were at home and growing up was that we allowed them to challenge any ideas we threw out there, as long as it was in a respectful way. So I could say something, and I didn't just expect my children to say, oh yeah, all right, or just be quiet about it. If they disagreed with it, I expected them to let me know they disagreed with it. And of course, in practice, this doesn't always work out as well as what it does in theory, because sometimes when we disagree, and then I do want to push my parental authority, or they did want to rebel against what I was saying, whatever, then there's times where that breaks down. But for the most part, it needs to be an open conversation in your house, especially as they get older. You have to respect that they have minds, they're thinking. Your training has hopefully gone into effect, and they're thinking about the things you told them. And if you're telling them something that doesn't make sense to them, or you're being hypocritical, then you have to stand up and be able to accept legitimate discussion and criticism. And that's how a family can work together. And if everybody understands what the goal and vision of the family is, then this can all work together in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, I'm at the end of my time. That's all I have for now. So open it up to any questions.